Tell me about a time you resolved a misunderstanding. Introduction. This is a common behavioral interview question for software developers, backend developers, full-stack developers, senior developers, and team leads. Interviewers ask this question to understand whether you can communicate clearly, whether you can handle confusion without blaming others, how you clarify requirements or expectations, whether you listen before responding, how you handle misunderstandings with QA, product owners, front-end teams, DevOps, or other developers, whether you document agreements properly. Check whether you can prevent the same misunderstanding from happening again. This question is especially important for check Java developers, backend developers, Spring Boot developers, full-stack developers, senior software developers, team leads, Agile teams, cross-functional teams. The best way to answer this question is by using the STAR method. STAR means dot. S. Situation. Explain the background. T. Task. Explain your responsibility. A. Action. Explain what you personally did. R. Result. Explain the final outcome. A good interview answer usually spends 10% situation, 10% task, 60% action, 20% result. The most important part is the action section, because interviewers want to understand how you clarified the misunderstanding, communicated respectfully, aligned people, and improved the process afterward. Question. Tell me about a time you resolved a misunderstanding. Example 1. Misunderstanding about API response format situation. In one project, our backend team was building a Spring Boot API for a front-end screen. The front-end developer expected a flattened response format that could be displayed easily in a table. However, the backend implementation returned a nested response because it followed the domain model more closely. This created confusion during integration. Task. I needed to resolve the misunderstanding quickly so front-end integration could continue. Action. I first spoke with the front-end developer to understand exactly what they expected. They explained that the UI needed simple fields for table display, filtering, and sorting. Then, I reviewed the original story and API notes. I realized that the acceptance criteria described the screen behavior, but the response format was not clearly documented. The misunderstanding happened because both sides made different assumptions. The front end assumed the API would be screen-friendly. The back end assumed the API should mirror the domain model. I arranged a short discussion with the front-end developer, QA, and product owner. We clarified. Check required UI fields, field names, nested versus flattened response, optional fields, empty result behavior, validation error response, sorting behavior, sample JSON. I proposed a screen-specific DTO. This DTO would flatten only the fields needed by the UI. Avoid exposing database entities directly. Keep internal domain models separate. Make front-end integration easier. Make QA validation clearer. After agreement, I updated the API response, documentation, and sample JSON. Result. The misunderstanding was resolved. Front-end integration continued smoothly. QA also benefited because the expected response format was now clearly documented. Why this answer works. This answer is strong because it shows check requirement clarification, check front-end back-end collaboration, check no blame communication, check API design maturity, check documentation improvement, check practical resolution. Example 2. Misunderstanding about business requirement situation. In one sprint, I worked on a report feature. The story said the report should show records for a selected date range. I implemented the API using UTC date boundaries. Later, the product owner said the report totals did not match business expectations. The business expected the selected dates to follow the local business time zone. Task. I needed to resolve the misunderstanding and correct the report logic. Action. I first avoided assuming that either side was wrong. I reviewed the story, acceptance criteria, and sample report output. Then I met with the product owner and QA to clarify the expected behavior. We discussed Check. Start date behavior, end date behavior, local time zone, UTC timestamp storage, records near midnight, daylight saving time, inclusive and exclusive date boundaries, expected sample output. I realized the misunderstanding happened because the requirement said date range, but it did not clearly define time zone boundaries. I explained the technical reason in simple terms. The database stores timestamps in UTC, but the business wants the report grouped by the local business day. Then, I updated the backend calculation logic to convert the selected business dates into the correct UTC range before querying. I added tests for check records near midnight, start date boundary, end date boundary, month-end records, daylight saving time scenario, empty result, normal daytime records. I also updated the story notes so future reporting work would clearly mention time zone assumptions. Result: the report totals matched business expectations. QA had clear test cases. The team learned to clarify time zone rules early for reporting features. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows: check. Business requirement clarification. Check. Time zone awareness. Check. Respectful communication. Check. Data accuracy. Check. Regression testing. Check. Prevention of future misunderstanding. Example 3. Misunderstanding between QA and development situation. In one sprint, QA raised a defect for an API validation scenario. From the development side, the API was returning the expected HTTP status code. However, QA said the error message was incorrect and marked the defect as high priority. At first, it looked like QA and development had different expectations. Task: I needed to clarify the misunderstanding and decide whether the behavior should be changed. Action: I reviewed the defect details carefully. I checked. Check. API request payload, HTTP status code, actual error message, expected error message, user scenario, acceptance criteria, previous API behavior, QA test case. Then, I spoke with QA directly. QA explained that the status code was correct, but the message was confusing for users. The misunderstanding was that development focused on technical correctness, while QA focused on user-facing clarity. I agreed that both perspectives mattered. I involved the product owner to confirm what message would be most helpful for users. Then I updated the API response to include clear validation message, field-level error detail, consistent error code, correlation ID, user-friendly wording. I also added a regression test for that validation case. Result: the defect was resolved. QA accepted the change. The team became better aligned on evaluating API errors from both technical and user experience perspectives. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows QA collaboration, user impact thinking, technical and business alignment, calm conflict resolution, better error handling, improved testing. Example 4. Misunderstanding about deployment ownership situation. In one release, our feature needed a new environment variable for an external service URL. The development team assumed DevOps would configure it during deployment. DevOps assumed the development team would provide the exact configuration details earlier. As a result, deployment preparation was delayed. Task: I needed to resolve the misunderstanding and make sure the release could proceed safely. Action: I first reviewed the deployment notes and identified what was missing. The missing information included, environment variable name, expected value per environment, external service URL, secret or config location, smoke test endpoint, rollback note, owner confirmation. Instead of blaming DevOps or the development team, I focused on closing the gap. I created a small configuration summary and shared it with DevOps. The summary included add config key, expected value, environment details, service dependency, validation step, contact person, rollback guidance. Then, I joined a short discussion with DevOps, QA, and the release manager. We agreed that development would provide configuration requirements earlier, and DevOps would confer readiness before release. I also updated the deployment checklist to include configuration ownership. Result: the missing configuration was added. The release proceeded successfully. The updated checklist helped prevent the same misunderstanding in future releases. Why this answer works. This answer is good because it shows: check DevOps collaboration, check ownership clarification, release readiness, no blame problem solving, documentation improvement, process maturity. Example 5. Misunderstanding about story scope situation. In one sprint, the product owner expected a report feature to include export functionality. The development team thought export was out of scope because the story mainly described screen display and filtering. This misunderstanding was discovered during sprint review preparation. Task: I needed to help clarify the scope and avoid creating conflict between the business and development team. Action: I first reviewed the story, acceptance criteria, and previous refinement notes. The story clearly mentioned: check report screen, check filter by date, check filter by status, display result count, check show report table. But export functionality was discussed verbally during refinement and was not added to the acceptance criteria. I explained this respectfully to the product owner. I also acknowledged that the product owner's expectation was understandable because export had been mentioned earlier. Instead of saying that was not in the story, I suggested a practical solution. We agreed to complete the screen display feature for the current sprint, create a follow-up story for export, define export format clearly, clarify CSV or PDF requirement, define file naming, define large data behavior, define QA test cases. I helped write the follow-up story with clear acceptance criteria. Result: the misunderstanding was resolved professionally. The current sprint goal was protected. The export functionality was planned properly instead of rushed. Why this answer works. This answer is strong because it shows scope clarification, product owner collaboration, respectful communication, agile maturity, follow-up planning, avoiding blame. Example 6. Misunderstanding about code review comment situation. In one code review, a senior developer left a comment saying that my service method had too much responsibility. At first, I thought they were asking for a large refactor of the whole class. I was concerned because the sprint timeline was tight. Task: I needed to clarify the feedback before making unnecessary changes. Action: instead of assuming what the reviewer meant, I asked for clarification. I asked whether they wanted check full service refactor, smaller method extraction, moving validation logic, separating mapping logic, reducing duplicate code, improving testability, only for the changed area. The reviewer clarified that they were not asking for a full refactor. They only wanted the new logic separated so the method remained readable and easier to test. I updated the code by
extracting validation into a helper method,
moving mapping logic into a mapper, keeping unrelated existing code unchanged, adding focused unit tests, updating the PR description. Result: the code became cleaner without increasing sprint risk. The reviewer approved the PR. I learned to clarify code review comments before assuming the scope of feedback. Why this answer works. This answer is good because it shows code review maturity, clean code, asking clarifying questions, avoiding unnecessary work, clean code improvement, time management, respectful collaboration. Example 7. Misunderstanding with support team about production issue situation. In one production support case, the support team reported that the backend API was down. When I checked the monitoring dashboard, the API was still running and responding to many requests. There was a misunderstanding about the actual issue. Task: I needed to clarify the production problem and help support communicate accurate information. Action: I first asked support for specific examples. I requested check affected user ID or safe reference, timestamp, endpoint or screen, error message, correlation ID, steps to reproduce, screenshot if available, frequency of issue. After reviewing logs, I found that the API was not fully down. Only one downstream dependency was timing out for a specific user flow. I explained the difference clearly. The API is available, but one flow is failing because the downstream service is timing out. Then, I helped create a more accurate incident update. The update included affected flow, user impact, current status, workaround if available, team investigating downstream timeout, next update timing. I also worked with the downstream team to investigate latency. Result: the support team updated the incident message accurately. The right team was engaged. The issue was resolved faster because the misunderstanding about API down was clarified. Why this answer works. This answer is strong because it shows: check production support maturity, check fact-based investigation, check clear communication, check incident accuracy, check cross-team coordination, check user impact focus. Example 8. Misunderstanding about done criteria situation. In one sprint, I completed a backend API story and moved it to ready for QA. QA later said the story was not ready because test data and expected responses were missing. I thought development complete meant code and unit tests were done. QA expected the story to include enough handoff information for testing. Task: I needed to resolve the misunderstanding and improve our definition of ready for QA. Action: I first spoke with QA to understand what information they needed. They explained that for backend API stories, they needed check endpoint details, sample request, sample response, test data, happy path scenario, negative scenarios, expected status codes, role-based behavior, regression areas. I realized that my understanding of ready for QA was incomplete. I created a QA handoff note for the current story. The note included each feature summary, API endpoint, sample JSON, test users or roles, test data, expected errors, regression areas, known limitations. Then I suggested adding QA handoff information to our team's definition of ready for QA. Result: QA testing continued with less confusion. The team updated its working agreement. Future backend stories had clearer handoff notes, which reduced repeated questions and delays. Why this answer works. This answer is good because it shows ownership of misunderstanding, QA collaboration, process improvement, better handoff, clear definition of done, team learning. Best short answer version. If you need a short interview answer, you can say, in one project, our backend team was building a Spring Boot API for a front-end screen. The front-end developer expected a flattened response format for easy table display, but the backend returned a nested response because we followed the domain model. When integration started, this caused confusion. Instead of blaming either side, I reviewed the story and realized the response format was not clearly documented. I set up a quick discussion with the front-end developer, QA, and product owner to clarify the required fields, optional fields, sorting behavior, empty result behavior, and sample JSON. We agreed to create a screen-specific response DTO that flattened only the fields needed by the UI while keeping the internal domain model separate. I updated the API response, documentation, and test notes. As a result, front-end integration continued smoothly. QA had clear expectations, and the team learned to document API contracts earlier for future stories. Common mistakes to avoid. 1. Blaming the other person or team. Bad answer. They misunderstood the requirement. Better answer. The requirement was not clear enough, so I helped clarify the expectation and document the agreement. 2. Assuming you already know the problem. Bad answer. I told them what I meant. Better answer. I first listened and asked questions to understand where the misunderstanding came from. 3. Not documenting the clarification. Bad answer. We talked and resolved it. Better answer. We updated the story API documentation, sample JSON, or checklist so the agreement was clear. 4. Making it a personal conflict. Bad answer. They were confused and blamed me. Error answer. There was a gap between assumptions, and I focused on aligning everyone around the facts. 5. No prevention. Bad answer. The misunderstanding was fixed. Better answer. We improved the process, so the same type of misunderstanding would be less likely in the future. Best practices for answering this question. Use the STAR method. Choose a professional misunderstanding. Avoid blame. Explain both sides fairly. Show how you clarified facts. Ask questions before reacting. Bring the right people together. Document the final agreement. Show a positive result. What interviewers are looking for. Interviewers want to see whether you can. Check. Communicate clearly. Resolve confusion professionally. Listen before responding. Clarify requirements. Work across teams. Avoid blame. Document decisions. Prevent repeat issues. For senior roles, they also want to see stakeholder alignment, cross-team communication, ownership of ambiguity, process improvement, production support maturity, leadership through clarification, ability to reduce delivery risk. Strong words to use in your answer. You can use words like clarified, aligned, listened, confirmed, documented, reviewed expectations, resolved confusion, brought the right people together, updated acceptance criteria, created shared understanding, improved handoff, prevented recurrence. Example: I resolved the misunderstanding by listening to both sides, reviewing the acceptance criteria, clarifying the expected behavior with the right stakeholders, documenting the final agreement, and updating our handoff process to avoid similar confusion later. Good misunderstanding topics you can use. Depending on your experience, you can talk about API response format misunderstanding, business requirement misunderstanding, QA defect expectation misunderstanding, deployment ownership misunderstanding, story scope misunderstanding, code review comment misunderstanding, production issue misunderstanding, done criteria misunderstanding, field naming issue, time zone expectation in reports, environment configuration ownership, test data expectation, role-based access expectation, error message expectation, release readiness expectation. Final summary. Tell me about a time you resolved a misunderstanding is an important interview question because software projects often fail not because of technical difficulty, but because people make different assumptions. The best answer should include what the misunderstanding was, who was involved, why the misunderstanding happened, how you listened, what facts you clarified, who you aligned with, what was documented, what result improved, what process changed afterward. Good examples include API response format misunderstanding, time zone requirement misunderstanding, QA defect expectation misunderstanding, deployment ownership misunderstanding, scope misunderstanding, code review misunderstanding, production issue misunderstanding, QA handoff misunderstanding. The strongest answers show communication, ownership, patience, no blame problem solving, documentation, and prevention.